It's a story so embedded in modern culture that we often feel like we know every single detail. But today, we're going to set aside some of that folklore. We're taking the comprehensive stack of sources you provided and performing a really surgical analysis of one of history's most profound peacetime tragedies.
The sinking of the RMS Titanic.
Exactly.
And our focus here is really on fact, on context, and consequence. The Titanic sank in the freezing North Atlantic on April 15th, 1912.
Just 4 days into her maiden voyage.
A mere 4 days, from Southampton to New York City. The mission here is to trace that precise chain of events.
Right.
From, the pre-existing design flaws and the ignored warnings to the chaotic final moments and the sweeping regulatory changes that came after.
And the scale of that loss is just crucial context right from the very beginning. The ship carried an estimated 2,224 people.
That's an almost unbelievable number.
And the catastrophe itself, from the moment of impact to the moment the ship finally disappeared, it lasted just 2 hours and 40 minutes.
And in that time,
between 4,490 and 1,635 people died. It places it among the deadliest maritime disasters ever recorded.
This tragedy, it really did redefine modern shipping safety. And the reason it did so lies in the sheer confidence surrounding the ship itself.
Okay, so let's unpack that. This symbol of early 20th century industrial might. The Titanic wasn't just a ship, was she? She was a kind of proclamation of what human engineering was capable of.
Absolutely. She was the largest ocean liner in service at the time, the second of the 3 famous Olympic-class liners built by Harland and Wolff.
And to really grasp her size, what are we talking about compared to her rivals?
Well, the sources highlight that the Titanic and her sister ship, Olympic, were almost 1.5 times the gross registered tonnage of competitors like Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania.
Wow.
She was nearly 900 feet long, designed to carry 3,547 people.
And while the engineering was completely revolutionary, it was the luxury that arguably captured the world's imagination. This was pure opulence, designed for the absolute elite.
It was a floating extension of the wealthiest homes in the world. The premium parlor suites, the most exclusive accommodation, they cost over $4,350 for a one-way passage.
And what's that in today's money? It must be astronomical.
When you account for inflation, that's equivalent to about $142,000 today.
For a one-way ticket.
For a one-way ticket. The expense was enormous, and it bought unparalleled comfort.
But what's often overlooked, I think, is that even the third-class conditions were a major selling point for hopeful immigrants.
That's a really vital piece of context. White Star Line understood that many of their passengers were crossing the ocean for a better life.
So this wasn't the steerage of old.
No, not at all. The third-class accommodations offered plentiful good food and conditions that were, generally superior to what many of those passengers had known back home in Europe.
Right.
It offered a standard of living that felt genuinely luxurious compared to their previous experiences, which is why the ship attracted such a diverse and hopeful passenger list.
But before the ship even properly left the harbor, the voyage began with a terrifyingly close call right there in Southampton. Tell us about that near collision.
Well, just after slipping her moorings on April 10th, the Titanic's immense bulk and speed created hydrodynamics unlike anything the port had handled before.
Okay.
Her displacement pushed this huge wave of water away, which then created a kind of vacuum or trough.
So that sudden shift in the water level essentially yanked another ship towards the Titanic.
Precisely. The strain caused the mooring cables of the nearby SS City of New York to snap.
Oh, wow.
And the New York immediately began swinging, stern first, toward the Titanic. Captain Edward Smith had to act incredibly fast, ordering the engines put full astern to stop the forward momentum and prevent a collision.
And they averted this disaster by what? Just a few feet?
4 feet.
4 feet.
Yes. A tugboat had to intervene and pull the New York clear, and it delayed the Titanic's departure slightly. The incident was an unsettling reminder right at the start of the sheer, overwhelming physical force this ship represented.
Let's talk about the crew. Captain Smith, he had extensive experience, but the crew's composition itself seems like a recipe for chaos in an emergency.
That absolutely was. Captain Smith had decades of service with the White Star Line, but the bulk of the 892 crew members were dedicated to service and mechanics, not sailing.
Right.
They were engineers, firemen, stokers, and stewards. Their job was either to keep the ship moving or...
to keep the passengers comfortable.
Exactly.
So how many actual trained navigators or deckhands did that leave?
A tiny fraction, only about 5% of the total crew. We're talking about the 6 watch officers and 39 able seamen.
That's it.
That's it. And even more critically, most of the crew, including the engineering and service staff, were only hired on at Southampton.
So they didn't know the ship.
They had no time to truly familiarize themselves with the ship's intricate geography, especially not the emergency protocols or the lifeboat stations.
And on top of that, the ship carried another hidden vulnerability that had been actively burning for days.
Right.
The coal fire.
That detail often gets lost, but it speaks volumes about the level of risk the operators were managing. A fire started in one of the massive coal bunkers approximately 10 days before the ship departed.
10 days before.
It burned persistently. The crew managed to keep it under control, but the sources confirm it was still burning for several days into the voyage.
So it was only put out on the 13th.
It was only fully extinguished on April 13th, the day before the ship encountered the ice. They were dealing with an active internal crisis while steaming across the ocean.
So as the ship enters April 14th, the environmental factors become just overwhelming. The sources are so clear on this. The North Atlantic ice conditions were the worst of any April in the last 50 years.
This was not typical ice activity at all. It was attributed to an unusually mild winter that had caused large numbers of icebergs calved off the Greenland glaciers to drift much further south than normal.
And they were right in the main shipping lane.
Directly in the main shipping lane.
And this is where the institutional failure in communication really takes center stage. The Titanic receives warnings, but the system itself seems designed to prioritize profit over safety.
That's the core insight here. The two radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were not employees of the White Star.
Right. They worked for Marconi.
But worked for the Marconi Company. Their professional obligation was to prioritize commercial passenger messages, the Marconigrams, over relaying weather and hazard reports to the bridge.
And that business structure was a systemic, fatal flaw.
It was.
So they received 6 specific iceberg warnings throughout that day. Let's just trace this timeline of ignored opportunity.
The first message came in early at 09:00 from the RMS Caronia. It clearly reported bergs, growlers, and field ice.
And that was acknowledged.
Captain Smith acknowledged that one, yes. Later, at 13:42, the RMS Baltic relayed another warning from a Greek vessel, mentioning passing icebergs and large quantities of field ice.
And Smith acknowledged that one, too.
He did, and he used it to inform a small course adjustment, ordering a slightly southern track.
But that adjustment, it just wasn't enough, and the communication continued to break down.
It did. By 13:45, the SS America reported passing 2 large icebergs. However, there's no confirmation that this specific message ever reached the bridge.
Why not?
Well, the radio equipment had suffered a breakdown and repair the night before, which may have contributed to key messages being missed or overlooked in the subsequent communication recovery.
And this brings us back to that passenger message backlog, which really seems like the turning point.
It was the human tragedy of information overload. At 21:40, the SS Masaba sent an extremely explicit warning. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice.
A critical message.
Critical. And it was never delivered to the bridge. Phillips, the senior operator, was intensely focused on clearing this huge queue of passenger messages through the relay station at Cape Race. He simply filed the Masaba's warning away.
And the final warning, the most immediate and critical, was actively shut down.
Yes, the truly astonishing moment occurred at 22:30. Operator Cyril Evans of the SS Californian.
This is the ship that had already stopped for the night.
Exactly, because it was surrounded by an ice field. He signaled a warning. Phillips, frustrated by the interference, cut him off.
He told him to shut up.
He signaled back for the Californian to shut up because they were jamming the fainter signal from Cape Race that Phillips needed for his commercial traffic.
Unbelievable.
A Californian's operator, having delivered his warning and been rebuffed, shut down his equipment and went to bed.
Lame.
15 minutes before the Titanic hit the ice.
That is just incredible. The lifeline was literally silenced because of a backlog of social messages.
A deadly irony of early global communication.
So, with 6 warnings, several of them specific and recent, why was the ship still steaming at 22 knots? That's only 2 knots short of its maximum speed.
Yeah.
Was this just an act of recklessness?
It was routine, but a routine driven by commercial pressures and a profound overconfidence in technology. North Atlantic liners prioritized timekeeping above all else.
So this was standard practice.
The standing practice of the era was to maintain high speed and rely solely on the lookouts to spot ice in time to maneuver. It was the maritime version of a belief in infallibility.
And there was a history that supported that confidence, wasn't there? The idea that even if they hit something, the ship would survive.
Exactly. The mindset was that the risk posed by ice was negligible. The sources cite the 1907 example of the German liner SS Kronprinz Wilhelm.
Right, that rammed an iceberg.
It did. It suffered a crushed bow, but still managed to complete her voyage. Captain Smith himself had famously stated that he had not imagined any condition which would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that.
That toxic combination of speed and hubris led directly to the conditions surrounding the collision at 23.39.
And the conditions were almost uniquely challenging for detection. While the air temperature was near freezing, the sea was, like glass, perfectly calm.
Which sounds serene.
It does. Colonel Archibald Gracie noted that the stars were clearly reflected in the water. But, ironically, calm water removes the one factor that usually reveals icebergs: waves breaking against them. The flat sea made the bergs almost impossible to spot until they were extremely close.
And then there's the legendary mistake. The missing binoculars for the lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee.
They were missing, yes, due to a mix-up with the officer transfer in Southampton. But critically, some hydrodynamics experts argue that even with binoculars, detection would have been near impossible in the total moonless darkness. The ship's own lights created a glare effect.
But I found the theory about the mirage truly fascinating. This suggests the lookouts may not have been able to see anything, regardless of the gear they had.
It's a compelling, more recent theory. It posits that a mirage, an atmospheric refraction caused by warm air meeting the extreme cold water, created a phenomenon called a raised horizon.
It blurred the line between the water and the sky.
That's the idea. This optical distortion could have effectively obscured the iceberg from the lookout site until just moments before the impact, around 23.39.
So Fleet spots the berg and immediately calls the bridge. What happens in those final seconds?
Fleet calls, "Iceberg, right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch on the bridge gave the order to turn hard to starboard.
Which means swing the ship sharply to the left.
To the left, yes. At the same time, he signaled full astern on the engine telegraphs.
And this is where we run into that critical physics problem. So slowing down, which sounds like the natural, cautious instinct, was actually the one thing that kept the ship from turning as quickly. Can you explain the physics of that?
That's the key technical failure. The Titanic's massive single rudder relied on water flowing past it, pushed by the propellers to gain maximum turning effectiveness.
Okay.
When Murdoch ordered the engines reversed or stopped, he dramatically reduced the water flow over the rudder. This left the ship relying only on its forward momentum, significantly increasing the time up to 30 seconds needed for the rudder to initiate a sharp turn.
And if he had maintained speed?
If he had maintained speed, the turning radius might have been smaller, allowing the ship to clear the ice completely.
Instead, they suffered a glancing blow.
A 6-second scrape. The ship avoided the head-on collision, but an underwater spur of the ice scraped along the starboard side, popping rivets and tearing seams along a 300-foot distance.
For decades, the public believed this impact resulted in a massive, continuous tear, the infamous Big Gash. But the sources clearly state that modern evidence has confirmed that is absolutely a myth.
It is entirely a myth. That idea came from the initial inquiries trying to calculate the extent of the flooding. However, the chief naval architect at Harland and Wolff, Edward Wilding, testified early on that the total area of the hull opening to the sea was somewhere about 12 square feet.
Wait, 12 square feet in total? That's tiny compared to the size of the ship.
It's an astonishing detail. Modern ultrasound surveys of the wreck and a recent digital resurrection confirmed this. The damage consisted of 6 separate, narrow openings, totaling only 12 to 13 square feet.
So the largest holes were like a couple of sheets of paper.
The largest destructive punctures were only the size of a couple of sheets of A4 paper.
So the sinking wasn't due to one enormous rip, but rather a series of small, critical failures distributed along the hull plates.
Precisely. The enormous stress and the impact didn't tear the heavy steel plates. Instead, they popped open the rows of rivets along the plate seams, creating tiny, unmanageable leaks across 6 compartments.
And this leads us directly to the debate about the quality of those rivets, the metallurgy controversy.
This focuses on the rivets used specifically in the bow and stern sections. They were triple riveted, but made of wrought iron, often classified as best or number 3 iron.
And research shows this iron had impurities.
It had high levels of slag inclusions, impurities, which rendered the rivets more brittle. Under the extreme cold of the North Atlantic and the intense lateral stress of the impact, they were prone to snapping open rather than bending.
But as always, there's a vital counterpoint to that claim. that prevents us from just blaming the builders.
And this is where critical thinking comes in. Critics of the metallurgy theory correctly point out that the sister ship, Olympic, used the exact same wrought iron rivets and served successfully for almost 25 years.
Right, and the Olympics survived multiple major collisions.
It did, including a deep gash from a warship and sinking a German U-boat with its bow without catastrophic structural failure. This suggests the flaw wasn't in the material itself, but in the context.
The speed.
The full speed combined with the brittleness of that material in extreme cold and stress.
Down in the boiler rooms, the engineers fought a desperate, immediate battle to save the ship.
They knew instantly the scale of the disaster. They were facing water rushing in at an estimated 7 long tons per second.
And the pumps couldn't handle that.
To give you an idea of the odds, the total pumping capacity of the ship was only 1,700 tons per hour. The flooding was 15 times faster than they could pump it out.
And their job wasn't just to pump, but to prevent a steam explosion, right?
Exactly. The engines and boilers were still running, full of scalding, high-pressure steam. Engineers like J.H. Hesketh and stoker Frederick Barrett narrowly escaped non-6 boiler room as the watertight door sealed.
So they were working in freezing, waist-deep water.
Waist-deep, to douse the furnaces and vent the remaining steam. This allowed the generators to run, keeping the lights and radio working until the final moments. It was a heroic, unsung effort.
And none of them survived.
Tragically, none of the 35 engineers and electricians survived.
Despite the incredible efforts of those engineers, the ship's fate was already sealed by the fundamental design of its internal divisions, the bulkhead flaw.
This is the definitive death sentence. The Titanic had 15 bulkheads, these heavy steel walls dividing the lower decks, designed to keep the ship afloat even if 4 forward compartments were completely breached.
But the glancing blow damaged 6 compartments.
Yes, the 4-peak tank, the 3 forward holds, and parts of boiler rooms 5 and 6.
So there were already 2 compartments past the safety margin.
And crucially, the bulkheads were not sealed at the top. They extended up to E deck, but that was not high enough.
So the water would just spill over.
Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, quickly recognized the flaw and informed Captain Smith. He explained that as the bow settled, the water would simply spill over the top of the bulkheads, flooding the next compartment sequentially, much like water cascading over the rim of an ice cube tray.
And his prediction was?
Andrews predicted the ship had no more than roughly 2 hours left before it sank.
The moment of truth arrived at 00.05 when Captain Smith ordered the distress calls sent out and the lifeboats uncovered. But even that critical SOS signal was flawed.
Yes, the distress signal, initially CQD, then SOS, contained incorrect coordinates provided by 4th Officer Boxall.
How far off was it?
It placed the Titanic about 13.5 nautical miles off her actual position on the opposite side of the ice field. This small error complicated rescue efforts for the distant Carpathia,
Which was 58 miles away.
58 miles away and would need 4 hours to reach the scene.
Meanwhile, the closest ship, the California, was right there, but entirely oblivious. It's just a shocking tale of institutional and human failure.
It's the disaster within the disaster. The Californian had stopped for the night and its only radio operator was asleep.
But they saw the rockets.
They did. Despite the radio silence, officers on the Californian's bridge saw 5 white distress rockets fired by the Titanic starting around 01.00. But Captain Stanley Lord failed to act.
He wasn't sure what they meant.
He was unsure whether the rockets were signaling distress or merely company recognition flares. He ordered a lookout to keep watch, but did not rouse his radio operator or move his ship.
Had the Californian responded, the sources suggest hundreds of lives would have been saved instantly. But we turn to the lifeboats, where the safety policy was just monumentally deficient.
The deficiency was astounding. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, including 4 collapsibles capable of holding 11,178 people.
Barely half the people on board.
Barely half, and only 1/3 the ship's full capacity. The irony is that the design was built to allow for 68 lifeboats.
But they opted for fewer.
They opted for fewer for the aesthetic reason of an unobstructed view on the promenade deck.
And the policy was based on this outdated assumption that lifeboats were only needed to ferry people to a nearby rescue ship, not to save everyone at once.
That was the fatal premise. Maritime regulation hadn't caught up to the size of the new liners. And this philosophy was confirmed by the fact that 33 out of 39 British liners over 10,000 tons similarly lacked sufficient lifeboat capacity.
So it was standard, but dangerously wrong practice.
Precisely.
The evacuation itself was characterized by contradictory orders and profound reluctance from the passengers.
The orders from Captain Smith were vague: put the women and children in and lower away. The two senior officers interpreted this command differently, which led to a survival disparity.
How so?
Second Officer Charles Light-Toller on the port side was rigid. He interpreted it as women and children only. He lowered many lifeboats with empty seats if no women or children were immediately present.
And the other officer?
First Officer William Murdoch on the starboard side was more flexible. He used women and children first and allowed some men to board if the boats were otherwise ready to leave.
It must have been so difficult to convince people to leave this enormous, brightly lit, seemingly safe ship for a tiny boat bobbing in the freezing dark.
Absolutely. Initially, many passengers simply treated the order as a drill or a joke. The sound of steam venting from the boilers was deafening, described as 20 locomotives blowing off steam.
I can't even imagine.
Famous passengers like John Jacob Astor declared, "We are safer here than in that little boat." This initial resistance meant that many early lifeboats were tragically lowered, severely underfilled.
As the danger became clearer, the stark social reality of the era asserted itself: the class divide.
The statistics later confirmed the awful truth, but physically, the ship ensured the divide. Third-class accommodations were located far below, on C through G decks at the extreme ends of the ship.
And first class was on the upper decks.
Closest to the lifeboats, proximity was destiny.
But the difficulties went beyond mere distance. There was active physical segregation that hindered the escape of the third-class passengers.
Yes, U.S. immigration laws required steerage passengers to be segregated to control immigration processing. This meant gates, partitions, doors.
And testimony suggests crew actively hindered them.
Testimony from survivors suggested that crew members actively locked companionways and gates, ostensibly to prevent steerage passengers from rushing the lifeboats. And the sheer ratio of stewards.
Right, there were fewer stewards for third class.
Far fewer for massive numbers of third-class passengers versus many for first class. It meant third-class passengers were often left completely to their own devices in the dark, unfamiliar corridors.
It's so important, though, to acknowledge the exceptional crew members who fought against that system.
We must. Third-class steward John Edward Hart, for example, ignored the institutional norms. He organized and personally escorted 3 separate trips into the deep interior of the ship to bring groups of third-class passengers up to the boat deck.
So he ensured that many who would have been trapped had a chance.
A chance to survive, yes.
The final hour was marked by these incredible moments of human dignity and heartbreaking choice. Tell us about the Strausses.
Ida and Isidore Strauss, the co-owner of Macy's, are the most famous example of dignity and refusal to separate. Ida was urged to board a lifeboat, but refused to leave her husband.
And she said,
"We have been living together for many years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together, awaiting their fate.
And another story, Lucian Smith.
Yes, he urged his wife, Eloise, to leave, reassuring her, "It is only a matter of form to have women and children first. The ship is thoroughly equipped, and everyone on her will be saved."
And the extraordinary formality displayed by Benjamin Guggenheim.
The industrialist recognized his death was imminent. He changed out of his life vest and rough clothing and put on his finest formal evening dress, stating his resolve to go down like a gentleman.
These moments just crystallize the profound choices made under unimaginable duress.
They really do.
And then there is the enduring folklore of the band playing until the ship sank. Was that true?
The music was absolutely real, and it was crucial. The ship's 2 bands combined and played lively, cheerful tunes, ragtime and waltzes, primarily to calm the passengers and prevent mass panic.
But the final song, that's still debated.
It remains a matter of conflicting survivor accounts.
The famous hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee."
Archibald Gracie, a prominent survivor, emphatically denied hearing that hymn. He claimed it would have been a shocking and tactless sign of immediate death. Others recalled hearing a popular tune called Autumn.
But some survivors did report hearing the hymn.
They did. The bandmaster of the rescue ship Carpathia reported that many survivors told him that as the end approached, the one hymn that appealed to all was indeed "Nearer, My God, to Thee."
Regardless of the final tune they played on.
All 8 musicians played until the final minutes and perished, demonstrating incredible courage.
As the water rose, the last lifeboat, Collapsible D, left the deck.
That was the last true chance, leaving at 02.05 with only 25 people aboard.
And this is where one of the greatest personal tragedies of the night happened.
Yes, first-class passenger Edith Evans gave up her place in that boat so that another woman might survive. She was one of only 4 first-class women lost that night.
And after that boat left,
Having secured the escape of the final boat, Captain Smith performed a last tour, telling the remaining men, including the radio operators, now it's every man for himself.
the final 5 minutes between 02.15 and 02.20 represent the physical collapse of that symbol of technological confidence. At 02.15, the angle increased dramatically.
The rapid influx of water caused a giant wave to sweep along the boat deck, instantly drowning anyone still attempting to launch the final collapsible lifeboats.
And the forward funnel collapsed.
Yes, the sheer stress caused the forward funnel, weighing dozens of tons, to collapse under its own weight, crushing several people struggling in the water below.
And the sound of the ship breaking apart must have been deafening. Many people believed they heard the boilers exploding.
That's the enduring misconception. Survivors described a tremendous rumbling roar, which was not a sudden explosion, but a progressive, catastrophic structural failure.
What did it sound like?
Lawrence Beasley described it as partly a groan, partly a rattle, and partly a smash, concluding that it was the machinery, engines, and heavy internal fittings coming loose and falling through the ship as the hull buckled.
And then, the ultimate terror. The loss of light.
Just before the hull broke, the electrical system failed. The lights flickered and then went out entirely, plunging the entire scene, the decks, the sea, the struggling people, into absolute pitch-black darkness.
And shortly after that,
Shortly after, the ship structurally failed at the weakest point near the engine room hatch, and the ship snapped in two.
despite initial testimony to the contrary, we now know from the wreck discovery that the ship broke violently in 2 pieces.
The extreme opposing forces, the flooded bow pulling it down and the trapped air keeping the stern afloat, caused the hull to snap. The bow section plunged relatively intact, digging a 66-foot gouge into the seabed.
And the stern.
The stern section, however, descended almost vertically. As it fell 2 miles, its empty tanks imploded under the immense water pressure, turning the structure into a chaotic mess of torn metal that buried itself deep in the sediment. The ship disappeared completely at 02.20.
Now we must address the experience of those hundreds of people suddenly plunged into the water. This is the part of the story that requires the most solemn reflection.
We must show sympathy for the victims facing those final minutes. The water temperature was lethally cold, measured at -2 degrees C, or 28 degrees Fahrenheit.
Which is below freezing for fresh water.
It is. The physiological reality is terrifying. Death comes rapidly, not from slow hypothermia, but from cold shock and cardiac arrest, usually within 15 to 30 minutes.
1,000 knives.
That's how Second Officer Lightoller vividly described the initial sensation, like 1,000 knives being driven into his body.
And the sounds coming from that mass of people must have been utterly horrifying for the survivors in the lifeboats.
Survivors later spoke about the sheer volume of sound. Lawrence Beasley recalled hearing every possible emotion of human fear, despair, agony, fierce resentment, and blind anger mingled. It was a deafening, unified scream.
The sound they could never forget.
A sound many survivors claimed they could never forget. The fact that the lifeboats, which collectively had room for nearly 500 more people, were floating nearby and listening to this chorus is perhaps the greatest failure of the night.
Why the paralysis? Was it purely fear? Or were there orders not to return?
It was overwhelmingly fear, combined with a lack of training. The occupants of the lifeboats, particularly the crew members commanding them, were terrified that if they turned back, they would be swamped by the hundreds of desperate people clinging to them.
Dragging the entire lifeboat down.
Yes. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, commanding Lifeboat Number 6, was adamant, telling the women aboard that there was no point returning, saying there were only a lot of stiffs there.
There was fortunately one shining exception to that inaction. 5th Officer Lowe.
Lowe, in charge of Lifeboat Number 14, waited about 20 minutes after the sinking for the mass screaming to subside. He organized the transfer of occupants to free up space, took a crew of 7 men, and rowed back to the site.
But by the time he arrived,
the awful chorus of yells had subsided into a dismal moaning sound, and quickly afterward into a horrifying silence. He found only 4 men still alive. 1 died shortly after.
that rescue, as small as it was, just emphasized the capacity for survival that the other boats had failed to exploit.
It really did.
We must also remember the men who survived clinging to the wreckage.
Approximately 35 men, including Lightoller and Colonel Archibald Gracie, managed to reach the upturned hull of collapsible Boat B.
But they had to make a terrible choice.
They were forced to ignore the desperate pleas of swimmers nearby. paddling slowly away for fear of being swamped and overturning the already precarious boat.
And even in that situation.
Even in that situation, Gracie recalled one swimmer replying to a refusal, "All right, boys, good luck and God bless you," showing immense final grace.
The long night finally ended with the arrival of the Carpathia.
The RMS Carpathia spotted the distress flares and the lights of the lifeboats around 03.30 and arrived on the scene around 04.0.
And her captain, Arthur Rostron.
He had driven his ship at maximum speed 17 knots through the night, dodging numerous icebergs at immense personal risk to his vessel and crew.
And what was the scene at dawn?
The survivors were greeted by a stunning, horrific scene. Fields of ice on which rested innumerable pyramids of ice, with 20 large bergs, some up to 200 feet high, looming nearby. It confirmed that the Carpathia had been steaming through the same deadly conditions.
So they were hoisted aboard?
Yes, via rope ladders and slings. By 09.00, all 710 survivors were safely aboard the Carpathia, which then turned back toward New York City.
The arrival of the Carpathia in New York finally revealed the full, devastating scope of the tragedy to the public.
On the evening of April 18th, 3 days after the sinking, the Carpathia docked at Pier 54. Reports indicate that some 40,000 people were waiting on the wharves, desperate for news.
And the recovery efforts that followed.
They managed to find 328 bodies, 209 of which were taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia for identification and burial. The simple, painful evidence found years later, pairs of shoes side by side on the seabed marks, the final resting places of those who were never recovered.
The public reaction was immediate grief and powerful outrage, particularly in the port of Southampton, which bore the heaviest human cost.
Southampton was the home port for 699 crew members, 549 of whom perished. The White Star Line offices were instantly overwhelmed by weeping, desperate families.
And the anger had two main focuses.
A dual focus, yes. The clear lack of lifeboats and the actions of the White Star Line chairman, J. Bruce Ismay.
Ismay, who survived aboard collapsible boat C, was condemned publicly. Even though he had arguably followed the women and children first protocol, the perception was that he, the owner, should have gone down with his ship.
He was vilified, widely condemned as a coward, and this public outrage provided the crucial momentum needed for regulatory change. The tragedy solidified the idea that standard, accepted practice was fundamentally unsafe.
This outrage fueled intensive public inquiries, both in the U.S. and Britain, which had to walk a very fine line between criticizing the actions taken and acknowledging the systemic failures.
Both inquiries were unanimous in their criticism of the outdated regulations concerning lifeboats and Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed despite multiple ice warnings.
And they condemned Captain Lord of the California.
Rightly so. They condemned him for failing to render assistance, a failure they believed cost hundreds of lives.
But the U.S. inquiry concluded that the disaster was essentially an act of God. That phrasing seemed to contradict all the evidence of human error.
It's a complex, legalistic conclusion. The U.S. inquiry suggested that because those involved had adhered to the standard, though flawed, maritime practice of the time, the disaster could only be classified that way.
But the British inquiry offered a warning.
It provided the necessary warning, yes. It noted that while Captain Smith followed practice, what was a mistake in the case of the Titanic would without doubt be negligence in any similar case in the future. That statement established the new legal and moral boundary.
This disaster single-handedly forced the world to change its maritime regulations, leading to the creation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS.
SOLAS, established in 1914, fundamentally governs modern maritime safety. It was the absolute, non-negotiable legacy of the Titanic.
And the new mandates included:
they included 247 radio manning on all passenger ships, the requirement that radio operators prioritize hazard messages over commercial communications, and most importantly, the mandate that all vessels carry enough lifeboats to accommodate every single person on board.
And the International Ice Patrol.
It also led to the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, which still monitors iceberg locations in the North Atlantic today.
To truly understand the failure of the old system and the necessity of these reforms, we have to look one last time at the casualty analysis and how survival rates were determined by class.
The statistics from the British Board of Trade are damning evidence of the social injustice inherent in the disaster. The overall survival rate was 32%.
But if you were a first-class woman, your chance of survival was nearly guaranteed.
Yes. 97% of first-class women were saved 140 out of 144. Contrast that with third-class women. Only 46% were saved, 76 out of 165.
So the systemic barriers, the distance, locked gates, lack of information, meant that being a woman was insufficient protection if you were in steerage. The
Exactly.
same disparity holds true for the youngest passengers.
Tragically so. All second-class children survived. Yet more than half of the third-class children, 52 of the 79, perished. This disparity starkly confirms that proximity to the boats and access to information, which were tied directly to social status, were the primary factors dictating survival.
And for men, regardless of status, the odds were universally grim due to the protocol being enforced, even unevenly.
Only 20% of men total were saved. The worst proportionate loss was among the second-class men, of whom 92% died. The protocol was enforced, but it exposed the deep inequities based on location and wealth.
Finally, what is the fate of the wreck itself, discovered in 1985 by Robert Ballard?
The wreck is steadily decaying. Scientists estimate that between 0.5 and 1 ton of metal is dissolving into oxide per day due to bacteria and environmental stresses.
So eventually, the structure will collapse.
The entire whole structure will collapse entirely. All that will remain are the most durable components. The bronze capstans, the massive propellers, and perhaps fittings like the compasses lying mingled with a vast field of rust on the seabed.
So our comprehensive analysis of these sources really confirms that the sinking of the Titanic was not a random, isolated incident.
No. It was the predictable consequence of outdated regulations, fatally flawed communication systems, and institutional arrogance that failed to respect an unprecedented natural hazard.
The real story is the profound human cost.
The profound human cost paid for the crucial knowledge that immediately saved countless lives through the subsequent global reforms of maritime safety.
For centuries, changes in maritime safety were incremental, slow, and reactive. The Titanic forced an immediate international reckoning that fundamentally reshaped global shipping protocols overnight. Now that you have this in-depth understanding, consider this. How often do we, even today, wait for a catastrophe of this magnitude before reforming standard accepted but fundamentally unsafe practices in our modern world?
Thanks for listening.